The year was 1878, and the world for Arthur Prescott had shrunk to the size of a single room, 4 log walls that had begun to feel more like a tomb than a home. Outside, the Montana plains stretched into an eternity of brittle, frost-killed grass under a sky the color of old pewter. Winter was not merely coming, it was already here, a hostile occupying force that had laid siege to his small, isolated homestead. A year. It had been a full year since the silence had descended, a year since Eleanor's laughter had been stolen by the fever that swept through the territory like a phantom reaper. In that year, Arthur had become a ghost in his own life. The fields he had once ploughed with purpose now lay fallow, choked with weeds that bowed their heads in the ceaseless wind. The sturdy barn he and Eleanor had raised together sagged slightly, its door hanging from a single hinge like a broken jaw. Grief was not just an emotion, it was a physical weight that stooped his shoulders, slowed his hands, and hollowed out his eyes until they were dark, vacant things. He moved through his days in a fog of memory and regret. Her presence was everywhere and nowhere. He saw her in the way the morning light struck the faded calico curtain she had sewn for the window, in the empty space beside him in the cold bed, in the worn patch on the floorboards before the hearth where she used to stand, humming as she stirred their supper. His life, once a vibrant tapestry woven with their shared dreams, had been reduced to a single frayed thread, survival. But even that was failing. The larder was a hollow echo of his neglect, a handful of potatoes, their skins wrinkled and soft. Half a bag of cornmeal, the bottom of which was now visible. A few strips of salted pork, so hard they might as well have been wood. He had hunted, but his heart wasn't in it. His hands, once steady, now shook with a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. The deer saw him coming, their white tails flashing like a taunt as they vanished into the pines. The first blizzard had come early, a furious white monster that had raged for 3 days, piling drifts against his door that were taller than he was. It had been a warning. The land, which had given them so much, was now reminding him how quickly it could take everything away. Starvation was no longer a distant possibility, it was a hungry wolf scratching at his door. He sat at the rough-hewn table, his hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm water, the last of his coffee grounds having been boiled 3 times over. His gaze fell upon the small, intricately carved wooden box on the mantelpiece. Inside lay the only thing of value he had left in the world. He didn't need to open it. He knew its contents by heart, by touch, by the searing pain it invoked. Eleanor's locket. It was silver, shaped like a heart, with tiny, etched forget-me-nots ringing its edge. Her father had given it to her on their wedding day. Inside, a miniature portrait of her, her smile so full of life it was a cruelty to behold, faced an empty space where a picture of him was meant to go. They never got around to having one made. There was always another chore, another season to prepare for. There was always, they thought, more time. To trade it was unthinkable. It was a sacrilege. It was like carving out a piece of his own soul and bartering it for bread. The locket was his last tangible link to her, the anchor of his memory. His fingers curled into fists on the table. He would rather starve. But then, a memory of Eleanor surfaced, not from the locket, but from his heart. He saw her face, her brow furrowed with concern, her hand on his arm. "You must live, Arthur," her voice whispered in the quiet room. "Promise me you will live." He had made that promise on her deathbed, a desperate, choked vow that he had since failed to keep. He had not been living, he had been waiting to die. The decision settled over him, cold and heavy as a burial shroud. He would go to Henderson's trading post. It was a 2-day ride in good weather, a perilous journey now, but he had no choice. He stood, his movements stiff, and walked to the mantel. He lifted the box, his hands trembling violently now. He opened the lid. The silver heart gleamed dully in the dim light. He picked it up, its familiar weight, a fresh agony in his palm. He did not look at the portrait inside. He couldn't. He snapped it shut, the click sounding as final as a coffin lid closing, and slipped it into the pocket of his worn coat. He was trading his past for a chance at a future he did not want. The journey was a brutal ordeal. The wind was a living thing, a malevolent spirit that shrieked and clawed at him, trying to tear the breath from his lungs and the warmth from his bones. His horse, a gaunt gelding named Solomon, plodded miserably through the snow, which in places drifted up to its belly. Arthur rode with his head bowed, his hat pulled low, the world reduced to the horse's straining neck and the endless, blinding white of the landscape. Twice Solomon stumbled, and the fear of being stranded, of freezing to death in that desolate expanse, was a far sharper pain than the gnawing hunger in his gut. He spent a night huddled in a shallow ravine, sheltering beside a meager fire that seemed to offer more smoke than heat. He gnawed on a piece of hardtack from his saddlebag, the last of his traveling rations, and stared into the flames, the silver locket a cold, dead weight in his pocket. He felt like a traitor. He was not just selling a piece of jewelry, he was selling the memory of love, the promise of forever, for a few bags of flour and some salted meat. The shame was a bitter acid in his throat. When he finally saw the curl of smoke that marked Henderson's trading post, he felt no relief, only a profound sense of dread. The post was a squalid collection of low-slung buildings huddled against a bleak, wind-swept bluff, a place that seemed to attract desperation like flies to carrion. It was a necessary evil, the only point of commerce for 100 miles in any direction. He pushed open the heavy plank door, and a wave of smells hit him: stale tobacco, uncured hides, whiskey, and the cloying scent of unwashed bodies. The room was dark and crowded. A few grim-faced trappers leaned against the counter, their eyes as hard and cold as river stones. In the corner, a pair of prospectors argued in low, guttural tones. And presiding over it all was Henderson, a man whose body seemed to be made entirely of soft, sagging spheres. He had a round face, a round belly, and small, shrewd eyes that missed nothing and valued nothing beyond its price in coin or trade. Arthur approached the counter, feeling the eyes of the room on him. He was a stranger here, and strangers were either opportunities or threats. He waited for Henderson to finish haggling with a trapper over a stack of beaver pelts. Finally, the big man turned his piggy eyes to Arthur. "Well?" Henderson's voice was slick with impatience. "Spit it out. I ain't got all day." Arthur's throat was dry. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the locket. For a moment he faltered. He couldn't do it. But then the image of his empty larder, of the promise he made to Eleanor, rose in his mind. He pulled it out and placed it on the rough, scarred wood of the counter. The silver heart lay there, stark and delicate against the grime. Henderson picked it up, his thick, sausage-like fingers fumbling with the clasp. He pried it open and grunted, squinting at the miniature portrait. "Pretty little thing," he said, his voice devoid of any appreciation. He weighed it in his palm. "Silver ain't worth much these days. Worn, too." He tossed it back on the counter as if it were a bauble. $15 in trade. Arthur's heart sank. It was worth 5 times that at least. "That's robbery," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. Henderson laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Take it or leave it, friend. Looks to me like you ain't in a position to be choosy." His eyes raked over Arthur's gaunt frame, his tattered coat. The assessment was cruel and accurate. Defeated, Arthur nodded. Flour, salt pork, coffee, and ammunition. As Henderson began to measure out the goods with deliberate, stingy slowness, the door creaked open again. A Cheyenne man entered, followed by a woman clutching a small, sleeping child wrapped in a thin blanket. The man was tall and carried himself with a quiet dignity, but his face was etched with worry. The woman, Mesa, was frail, her skin pale beneath its copper tone. A deep, racking cough shook her frame, and she leaned against her husband for support. The child whimpered in its sleep. The man, Vokin, approached the counter and laid a small stack of finely tanned rabbit pelts on the wood. "Medicine," he said, his English clipped but clear. "Food." Henderson didn't even look at the pelts. He waved a dismissive hand. "That trash won't buy you a damn thing. I told you before, I deal in buffalo hides or coin. Now get out, you're scaring my customers." The prejudice in the room thickened, palpable as the smoke. The trappers sneered. Vokin's jaw tightened, his dark eyes flashing with a fire that was quickly banked. He was proud, but his wife was sick. He looked from Henderson's sneering face to his wife's pained expression, and a look of pure despair crossed his features. He gathered his worthless pelts, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Arthur watched, his own misery momentarily forgotten. He saw the woman's labored breathing, the child's pinched face, the man's helpless rage. And something inside him, a long dormant piece of his soul that Eleanor had nurtured, broke through the ice of his grief. He thought of her, how she would have immediately offered whatever they had. He looked at the meager pile of supplies on the counter, his future, bought with the price of his past. Henderson turned back to him. "That's your lot," he said, shoving a bag of flour forward. Arthur looked at the bag. Then he looked at the Cheyenne family, who were turning to leave, their departure a quiet tragedy. He made a decision that felt both insane and absolutely necessary. He picked up the heavy sack of flour and the largest slab of salt pork. He walked over to the family as they reached the door. He held out the provisions. Vokin stopped, startled. He looked at Arthur, then at the food, then back at Arthur. His eyes were full of suspicion, confusion. White men did not give things away. "Take it," Arthur said, his voice low. "Your wife, your child, they need it more." He pushed the supplies into the man's arms. Vokin was so surprised he almost dropped them. He stared at Arthur, his gaze intense, searching. He looked past the ragged coat and the hollow cheeks, seeing something else. He saw the locket still lying on the counter. He saw the raw pain in Arthur's eyes. He saw a man who was giving away food he clearly needed for himself. Mesa, the woman, looked at Arthur, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of shock and gratitude. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Vokin did not speak. He simply held Arthur's gaze for a long moment, a silent communication passing between them that was deeper than any words. It was an acknowledgement of shared hardship, a recognition of an unexpected kindness in a world that offered little of it. Then he turned and led his family out into the biting wind. Arthur walked back to the counter, the weight of his remaining, pitifully small supplies, a stark reminder of his foolishness. He gathered them, stuffing them into his saddlebags, keenly aware of Henderson's contemptuous stare. "Bleeding heart," the trader muttered, snatching the locket and dropping it into a drawer. "You'll be dead by Christmas." Arthur didn't answer. He turned and walked out of the trading post, back into the unforgiving white. He felt strangely light. He had traded away his wife's last gift, given away half of what he'd bought with it, and was likely walking toward his own demise. But for the first time in a year, the crushing weight on his chest had lessened, just for a moment. He had acted not as a ghost, but as a man, Eleanor's man. The ride home was a blur of exhaustion and gnawing second thoughts. The brief flicker of purpose he had felt at the trading post guttered and died in the face of the vast, indifferent wilderness. What had he done? He had traded a sacred memory for a pittance, and then given half of that pittance away to strangers. Henderson's words echoed in his mind. "You'll be dead by Christmas." The sentiment was not cruel, it was practical. He arrived back at his homestead to find it looking even more desolate and lonely than when he had left. The snow had drifted up against the windows, making the interior of the cabin even darker, colder. He unpacked his meager supplies, the sight of them a mockery of his perilous journey. The silence of the cabin pressed in on him, louder than ever before. He had come back with less than he'd hoped for, and the one object that tied him to his past was gone forever. The following days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of rationing and shivering. He cut his meals down to a thin cornmeal gruel once a day. The hunger was a constant, dull ache in his belly. He spent his time staring into the fire, his mind a maelstrom of grief and regret. He tried to conjure Eleanor's face, but the image was becoming hazy, indistinct, as if by selling the locket he had somehow sold the clarity of his memory too. He was alone, truly alone now, adrift in a sea of snow and silence. He found himself thinking, unexpectedly, of the Cheyenne family. He wondered if the flour had been enough. He pictured the woman, Mesa, and her rattling cough, the small, quiet child. He remembered the look in Vokin's eyes, that intense, searching gaze. It was a strange comfort, this thinking of others. It was a small crack in the prison of his self-pity, letting in a sliver of light. But mostly he was just cold and hungry and terribly, terribly lonely. Almost a week passed. The sky remained a solid, unforgiving sheet of grey. One morning he was awakened not by the light, but by a sound, or rather, a lack of it. The wind, which had been his constant companion, had fallen silent. The world was utterly still, muffled by a fresh blanket of snow that had fallen overnight. He rose from his cot, his joints aching, and peered through a frosted pane of the window, and his heart stopped. His small clearing, his entire world, was surrounded. They stood like statues in the morning mist, silent and unmoving. Warriors, not a small band, but an army. They were on foot and on horseback, their figures dark against the snow. They ringed his cabin, his barn, the entire perimeter of his property. He tried to count, but lost track after 200. There had to be 500 men. 500 Cheyenne warriors, armed with rifles and bows, their faces grim, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Terror, cold and absolute, seized him. This was it. This was the end Henderson had predicted. They had come to raid, to take what little he had left, to finish the job that starvation had started. His mind raced. He thought of his rifle, loaded and leaning against the wall, one man against 500. It was not a fight, it was a slaughter. He stood frozen at the window, watching, waiting for the first war cry, the first arrow, the first charge, but they did not move. They simply stood there, a silent, menacing forest of men, their presence an overwhelming weight. The silence was more terrifying than any scream. Then, a rider detached himself from the front rank. He was mounted on a magnificent pinto warhorse that snorted and stamped in the deep snow. The rider was tall, wrapped in a heavy buffalo robe, a single eagle feather tied in his long, black hair. As he rode slowly forward across the pristine snow toward the cabin door, Arthur recognized him. It was Vokin. Arthur's blood ran cold. He had been a fool. His small act of charity had not been seen as kindness, but as weakness, a pitiful gesture from a dying man. Perhaps it had been an insult. He backed away from the window, his hand reaching for his rifle. His palm was slick with sweat. He would not die cowering. He would die on his feet. He would die like Eleanor's husband. He unbolted the door and stepped outside, the rifle held loosely in his hands, not aimed, but ready. The cold hit him like a physical blow. He stood on his small porch, a solitary, defiant figure, and watched Vokin approach. The hundreds of eyes behind the chief followed his every move. The weight of their collective gaze was immense, crushing. Vokin reined in his horse a dozen paces from the porch. He swung himself down from the saddle with a fluid grace that spoke of a lifetime of horsemanship. He did not look at the rifle in Arthur's hands. His eyes were fixed on Arthur's face. He began to walk forward, his moccasins making no sound in the deep snow. Arthur braced himself. His knuckles were white on the stock of the rifle. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct screamed at him to raise the gun, but he held his ground, his gaze locked with the approaching chiefs. Vokin stopped just before him, so close Arthur could see the intricate beadwork on his leather shirt. The air crackled with a tension so thick it felt hard to breathe. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then Vokin reached inside his buffalo robe. Arthur tensed, his finger moving to the trigger. This was it. But the hand that emerged did not hold a weapon. It was open, and resting in the palm, gleaming softly against the weathered skin, was Eleanor's silver locket. Arthur stared at it, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. The locket. Here. It was impossible. He looked from the locket to Vokin's face. The chief's expression was not hostile. It was solemn, serious, and held a depth of understanding that stunned Arthur into immobility. Vokin spoke, and his voice was deep and resonant in the profound silence. "The man at the trading post," he said in his careful English. "Henderson, he is a taker. He takes the land, the dignity, the hope from my people. He leaves poison in his path." He took a step closer, holding the locket out for Arthur to see more clearly. "I saw you. I saw your face when you gave him this." He gestured to the locket. "This is not a piece of metal. It holds a spirit, the spirit of the one you have lost. I saw the hole in your heart. It is a hole I understand." Arthur could only stare, dumbfounded. The rifle felt impossibly heavy in his hands. Vokin continued, his gaze unwavering. "My wife, Mesa, was sick. The winter sickness was in her lungs. The child was cold. We had nothing. That man, Henderson, he would have let us die in the snow. But you, with a greater hunger in your spirit than we had in our bellies, you gave us your food, you gave us your life." He paused, letting the words settle. "The flour you gave us made bread, the meat made broth. It gave my wife the strength to fight the sickness. It warmed my child. You did not know that Mesa is the daughter of a great chief of the southern Cheyenne, a man named Honyahaka. You did not know that I am his chosen war chief. You saw only a family in need." Vokin's gaze softened slightly. "I went back to the trader. I took from him what he took from you." There was a hard edge to his voice now, a hint of the violence he was capable of, and Arthur had no doubt that Henderson had not enjoyed the transaction. "This belongs to you. A man does not trade his heart for bread." He gently took Arthur's left hand, the one not holding the rifle, and placed the cold silver locket into his palm, closing Arthur's fingers around it. The familiar weight was a shock, a jolt of lightning that shot up Arthur's arm. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, hot against his frozen skin. Then Vokin did something that shattered the last of Arthur's fear and disbelief. He met Arthur's eyes, and a look of profound respect passed between them. He placed his own hand over Arthur's, over the locket. "In the tongue of my people," he said, his voice dropping low, "a man who gives when he has nothing, who shows honor when he is surrounded by despair, who respects the spirits of another's family, that man is not a stranger, he is not an enemy." He looked Arthur square in the eye, and the word he spoke next echoed across the silent, snow-covered clearing, witnessed by 500 warriors. "Brother." The word hung in the air, a bridge thrown across a chasm of culture, of language, of history. Arthur's grip on the rifle slackened, and he lowered it to his side, the weapon suddenly feeling obscene and out of place. He looked at the powerful hand covering his own, at the locket held safely within, and a year's worth of ice around his heart began to crack. Vokin turned and gave a sharp command in his own language. The silent warriors stirred, not with menace, but with purpose. They began to move forward, their arms laden. They were not here to take. They were here to give. They brought bison robes, thick and heavy, and piled them on the porch. They brought huge sides of smoked bison meat, bags of dried berries and roots, and bundles of firewood, already cut and seasoned. They moved with a quiet efficiency that was breathtaking to watch. They stacked the provisions neatly against the cabin wall, creating a bulwark against the winter that would last him until the spring thaw and beyond. Another group went to his barn, mending the broken hinge on the door and bringing hay for poor Solomon, who watched from his stall with wide, curious eyes. Arthur stood motionless, overwhelmed, the locket clutched in his hand. Vokin stood with him, a silent, powerful presence at his side. They watched as the Cheyenne transformed Arthur's homestead from a place of bleak survival into a bastion of security. Misa appeared, walking slowly from the back of the encampment. She looked stronger, the color returned to her cheeks. She held her child, who was now awake and looking around with bright, dark eyes. She came to Arthur and bowed her head slightly, a gesture of deep respect and thanks. Later, as the sun began its descent, painting the snow in hues of pink and orange, a fire was built in the center of the clearing. They shared a meal. Vulcan sat with Arthur, and they ate roasted bison meat, the rich taste an explosion of life in Arthur's mouth. They spoke little, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a shared understanding, a quiet companionship. "Henderson will not trouble you again," Vulcan said, staring into the flames. "He will not trouble anyone again. He has left the territory." The finality in his tone left no room for questions. Justice, swift and absolute, had been delivered. As dusk deepened into a cold, star-dusted night, the Cheyenne began to pack their camp. Their arrival had been a silent, terrifying spectacle. Their departure was a quiet, respectful withdrawal. One by one, the warriors mounted their horses or fell into line, melting back into the landscape from which they had emerged. Vulcan was the last to leave. He mounted his pinto and looked down at Arthur. "Live well, my brother," he said. "Honor the spirit in the silver heart. She gave you a good heart." With a final nod, he turned his horse and galloped into the darkness, leaving Arthur alone once more. But this time, the loneliness was gone. The silence that returned to the clearing was not the sound of absence, but the sound of peace. Arthur stood for a long time in the cold, the smoke from the dying fire mingling with his breath. He looked at the small cabin, now fortified with provisions, warmth, and an impossible hope. He looked at the vast, snow-covered plains, no longer seeing an enemy, but a world of profound and startling mystery. Finally, he raised his hand and opened his fingers. The locket lay in his palm, its silver surface reflecting the starlight. He gently pushed the clasp, and it swung open. He looked down at Eleanor's face, at her bright, loving smile. The pain was still there, a dull ache of loss that would never fully vanish. But it was no longer a destructive, all-consuming fire. It was a warm ember, a memory of a love so strong it had reached across the void of death and the chasm between two worlds to save him. He had thought the locket was his connection to her. He was wrong. The locket was just a thing. The true connection was the love she had instilled in him, love that had compelled him to an act of kindness, which had in turn brought kindness back to him 100-fold. Vulcan was right. Her spirit had given him a good heart. He closed the locket and slipped it back into his pocket, not as a relic of a buried past, but as a promise for a future he was, at last, ready to live. The long winter stretched before him, but he no longer feared it. He was not just a grieving widower on a lonely patch of land. He was Arthur Prescott, and he had a brother.